Tim Richards is the Morrison Chair of Agribusiness in the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. He holds an undergraduate business degree from the University of British Columbia and a Ph.D. in agricultural economics from Stanford University. He has published over 105 articles in top economics, marketing, and agricultural economics journals. He has won 12 Article of the Year awards, is co-editor of the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, and is on the editorial boards of 4 other journals. The focus of his research is quantitative marketing, data analytics, retailing strategy, agricultural labor, which you might have heard us speak about in the run-up to this session, and food policy. He also does extensive consulting work in the food retailing and manufacturing industries for clients that include Walmart, Kroger, SuperValu, Hormel, Sara Lee, JBS Swift, Foster Farms, and a number of others. And for people in the Alberta region, Tim has also grew up on a dairy farm outside of Red Deer, so we will treat him as an honorary son of the soil, an official son of the soil, I should say. Dr. Richards, the floor is yours. Welcome.
All right, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Brent and Stan. Whoop, let me share my screen. Hit the wrong button there. Share screen. Good. All right. So we're going to talk about fruit and vegetable value chains. Let me give a couple disclaimers right at the start here. I realize most of my audience is in Canada. This is a very US-centric sort of presentation. Being a Canadian, I realize that most fruit and vegetable value chains in Canada start somewhere in the US or somewhere in Mexico, not to disparage the BC fresh fruit industry at all or anything like that, but it's just reality. They always joke about, bringing grapefruit across to Canada and whether or not they're going to confiscate it for fear of killing the domestic Canadian grapefruit industry. Not likely to happen. At any rate, so well, I just got a message that I'm muted by host.
You're still coming through, so I think you're doing fine.
Okay, unmuted by host. There we go. Okay, I'll ignore all future Zoom messages. Second caveat, I teach in a business school. So you'll see that most of the stuff that I'm doing today is in my work as a supply chain researcher. Supply chain research uses economic concepts to more for business relevant questions and things. So not so much in terms of policy and government intervention in industries and things like that. So a lot of it will come across as very sort of business centric. And I think you'll see the connections to how that's both important and how it's relevant. And then we can talk about policy issues as we go forward. So just my objectives today is to basically provide an overview of the impacts of COVID on the fruit and vegetable industry. I did an article for the Canadian Journal of Ag Econ a few weeks ago. This basically follows the outline of that article. It's more of a survey piece than a deep dive into any specific issue with respect to fruit and veg. There's any one of a number of things we can talk about, and I'm going to go into different depths on different sorts of topics. We're going to start by talking about just basic data on consumption and supply shifts to highlight the major impacts. What is the biggest impact of COVID on fruit and vegetable supply chain? And then we're going to get under the hood and talk about how some of the industry responses to those impacts have both highlighted weaknesses in the industries and highlighted things that we can do better going forward and what the industry really is doing in real time to improve their response. We're going to talk about some of the more detailed issues with respect to online purchasing and how that's driven retailers to basically up their game in terms of both delivery and online purchase and pickup. We're going to talk about labor. You may have heard Stan and I talking about the importance of labor in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry in the US as elsewhere. Labor is absolutely key. You may have heard news reports from the US about the meat plants, and I'm sure you've talked about it earlier in this certificate session. It's more so in fruit and veg. It is that much more labor intensive and that many more workers in the industry. So we're going to talk about U.S. immigration law, and how it works and how it doesn't. And then we're going to do a little bit of outlook, talk about maybe some future prognostications for what's going to happen to the fruit and vegetable supply chain. So we're going to start by talking about some of these mega trends. You know, the loss of the food service channel is the biggest impact that we saw right away, and how that's impacted consumption, shipments, and pricing. And luckily, we have some more or less real-time data on what's happening in terms of shipments and such from the USDA. And then we're going to talk about sort of what I regard as what that's laid bare in terms of the industry. What it's shown is that there's a lack of resilience. And that's kind of a theme that I've heard throughout all different segments of agriculture, is that it's shown this lack of resilience. And we're going to revisit that from not really a formal perspective, but I'm going to talk about a model that I'm working on for a paper that I'm doing with some colleagues here at ASU that makes more sort of substantive comment on that resilience issue. Then we're going to talk more in detail about online purchasing and the potential implications of it. Then we're going to talk about food waste. I do a lot of research on food waste and how this is providing sort of an opportunity, I guess, to study food waste a little bit more careful way. My 11-year-old watches Mark Rober on YouTube. I don't know if you watch him. I highly recommend it. He's a 40-year-old guy, retired from NASA to be a YouTuber and teach kids physics. Awesome. But he refers to mistakes in designing these things as learning opportunities. So I'm going to use that terminology. Some of the mistakes that the fresh produce industry has made, hopefully they're going to use as learning opportunities. How they can develop supply chain flexibility and resilience, and how they can better understand consumer behavior going forward, and talk about just within retailers and within fruit and vegetable supplying firms themselves, how they can better manage their labor, and I guess lobby for, manage immigration programs that are out there. We're going to talk about that going forward. All right, so what happened? All right, you look at the major impact on the fruit and vegetable industry was the loss of the food service sector. If you look at the United States in general, 51% is food away from home, meaning restaurants, institutions, et cetera, 49% at home. I know in Canada, it's a lot less food away from home. It's about 30%, but the dynamic is going to be roughly the same. You know, restaurants shut down. So the fruit and vegetable sector lost that whole, if you think about the channels as being retail and food service, they lost the whole of one of them. Stay-at-home owners shut that down. So what happened to that volume that was going to food service? A lot of it moved to retail. We all saw, that we call it the stocking up phenomena that happened in early March. People went to retail stores. People stocked up on whatever they could find. A lot of it was wasted, though, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. There was this inflexibility in supply chains where suppliers, shippers just didn't have contracts to supply to retail, and they were food service suppliers. So a lot of that underlies these, news reports that we had of food that's just plain being wasted. Luckily, a lot of it's moving to food banks. There's a new program that's just underway in the United States called the Farmers to Families Food Box Program. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's $1.2 billion worth of money that's going to produce companies to nominally take food that was destined to food service, to box it up, take it to food banks, and be paid from the USDA for it. So how much volume are we talking about in terms of the amount of fruit and veg that could not go to food service? It's funny. I do a lot of work with retail scanner data and things. We know everything about what people purchase in retail and supermarkets and things. We know nothing about what they buy in food service. Due to a lack of data, restaurants are just a data black hole. So we have to kind of make guesses as to what people are buying in terms of volumes in restaurants. So if you look at the USDA maintains a food away from home, that's FAFH, price index. And if we use that price index to back out the implied amounts of volume, I reckon it's about 25% of volume of fruits and vegetables go to food service in the US relative to retail. So we're talking about 25% of volume that plain didn't have a home come mid-March. All right, so let's, I don't know if anybody's followed SafeGraph. It's a company that uses cell phone tracking data to manage footprints, collect data sources on where people are going. And this is just an illustration as to what happened to the restaurant sector in mid-March in the US. broken down by different sorts of restaurants. This is kind of interesting. I don't think that's relevant at all, but just the steepness of the drop, down to roughly 25% of volume. And we see that I'll show a graphic in a minute here that shows that for nicer restaurants, the higher end sorts of restaurants, that drop was even greater, down to 100%. This is, again, data from SafeGraph, again, those cell phone tracking data that measured foot traffic to retail stores. This is really interesting because we see in the US, the start of March 15th is what we call the stocking up phase. That's where people went into stores, realized that this may be a long-term thing, and this is the era of the toilet paper shortages, pasta running out in stores, beans, all those sorts of non-perishable items. It was a direct hit to the fruit and vegetable sector. Once those people, after they stocked up on all their non-perishables, obviously they accumulated a lot of perishables as well at the same time. But after that, they stopped going to the store. See, if you see that by mid-April, that line, that 2020 data blue line, actually dropped below where it was even before. We attribute that to the fact that people had full pantries and they're eating all of their pasta and things like that, and they're not going back to the stores to buy their fruits and vegetables. So they actually had a dip down below what was normal before it climbed back up toward the end of May, where we are now, where it's a relatively normal sort of foot traffic to retail stores. So I'm sure, pictures in Canada are relatively similar to this. It's basically a food service desert. People were just not going out to restaurants and still aren't in a lot of places. This is data. This is interesting. This is from OpenTable, an online reservation system in the US. This is more your nicer restaurants. This is what we call the fine dining restaurants, that take reservations and things. It dropped down to 100% below normal by mid-March. So that is kind of just a sign of the devastation of the food service sector. Retailers responded. Retailers had unprecedented traffic. A lot of them didn't know what to do with it. And this is an interesting slide because some of those stores that are at the top of this out of stock rate, meaning, I guess you could call it poorly managing their inventory, running out of stock, are some of the most admired retailers in the United States. Costco, Trader Joe's, Sam's Club. These are the best of the best in inventory management. We're still having stock out rates of over 50%. So retailers were basically caught off guard. They didn't know how to manage their inventories to deal with that sort of onslaught of foot traffic that cleaned them out of virtually everything that they had. So what are the implications of all this? Losing the food and hospitality, sort of the leisure sector. Stan and I were talking before the session started. Fully 50% of all the job losses in Arizona are from that sector. So that was really a loss of purchasing power. Regardless of what happened to foot traffic in stores and things, people just have less money to spend. Another really interesting implication is it really exposed the heterogeneity in these supply chains. We knew that growers and shippers were specialized in terms of either food service or retail contracts. We didn't realize the extent to which they were. So as we'll see, I've got a couple graphics coming up that put more flesh on this whole idea. But what we saw is that some were benefiting, some were getting higher prices, shipping the same amount to retail, couldn't sell enough, and others were losing everything. They didn't have markets for their products. So we saw the timing of perishable shipments became a real issue in April, but just because of that stock-up effect, and people were playing down their pantries, they weren't going back to stores, and it's the perishables that really suffered during that time. So that's when we saw the news stories of, burning onions, donating vegetables, dumping milk, et cetera, et cetera. And another important implication that we'll talk about a little bit more going forward is that, these stories about wasting food really gave impetus to start talking about alternative exchange platforms. These are just two examples. I actually have a meeting after this seminar with one in North Carolina that's looking at developing alternative ways for growers to find different channels to get their produce to markets. A market maker out of the University of Illinois, if we're sharing these slides, you can click on that link and have a look at what they do. It's really, really interesting. The Food Marketing Institute, the FMI in the United States, is a major trade association for food retailers in general. They maintain one called the Food Industry Exchange, and it's the same sort of thing. We're basically making markets for produce that didn't have markets before. All right, so that's the basic dynamic. That's the most important thing that happened, was losing the food service channel. So let's see how that impacted shipments. It's a basic data problem. We have very little data on shipments. For meat and dairy in the U.S., I don't know if anybody follows Jason Lusk. He's the department head of agricultural economics at Purdue. He's got an excellent blog. On Twitter all the time. He has been covering the impacts of COVID on the meat industry, and he reports almost like up-to-date data from USDA on the amount of slaughter of hogs and beef, et cetera, on a daily basis. We don't do that in fresh produce. There is no sort of concentrated data gathering mechanism for fresh produce, just because the fresh produce industry is less concentrated. Where there's maybe dozens of meat processing firms in the United States, there's thousands of fresh produce companies. So it's a real data gathering problem. Fortunately, the AMS, our Agricultural Marketing Service of the USDA, does maintain some data through what's called the Market News Service. That's movements, meaning shipments. They've got shipping point prices. They've got terminal market prices. They've got retail prices, which are kind of averages over broad geographies. So it's good because it's very up to date. It's a very broad commodity coverage. It's got a couple issues that I'm going to describe in a second, but it is a great source of data to get a handle on what's happening during COVID. So what I'm going to do in these few slides coming up, I'm going to race through a few of them for fear of taking all my time. I'm going to focus on 5 commodities. They're big ones. It's a very selective sort of sample, but they're all very important. Across fruit, some veggies. I'm going to talk about some volumes for all 5, and then I'm going to show some impacts on prices. We've got weekly data. I'm going to talk about shipping point prices and retail market or shipping point movements, and I'm going to talk about retail market prices. One caveat, there are a couple caveats. This is a voluntary data process. The data may not cover the whole market. They tell us it's about 90% coverage, but it should be correlated over time, right? If I'm going to compare 2020 to 2019 to get a sense of how the COVID crisis has impacted, 2020, assuming 2019 was relatively normal. So we're going to talk about how that impacted it. So if there's 90% reporting in 2019, chances are there's 90% reporting in 2020. So that correlation should still be there. And one thing we're talking, when we start to make inferences about food waste and things, if you think about perishables, they differ from meat, which can be frozen, and even other products, dairy, which can be dried and things like that. Fresh produce, if you don't eat it in general, potatoes can be stored for a while. But when we're talking about strawberries, lettuce, carrots, they go off relatively quickly. So if we think about the demand for perishable foods consumption being relatively constant, then we can infer that produce that's bought and didn't go from one channel to the other is likely to be wasted. All right, so let's look at strawberries just as a case in point. Again, these are shipments aggregated over all shipment points by week, and it shows kind of the dramatic impact that the hit of COVID had, the shutdown of that food service segment. Now I'm kind of arbitrarily drawing the week of March 10th, and that week below is because the dates aren't the same between 2019 and 2020. Obviously, that week measure across the bottom is calendar week of the year. So the first week of the year, second week of the year, and so on and so on. So arbitrarily, I'm assigning week 10 as the start of the COVID crisis in the United States. So as we see, there was really not much immediate impact in the first week, but by the second week, we saw that shipments started to fall. And we do a lot of work with strawberry growers in California, and they were having real labor issues. Now that's early in the strawberry season in California. It doesn't really kick in until early May. And by then we see that shipments upped a little bit, but then they were having real issues. That was having a hard time accessing labor. Once they got their stuff together though, and they were able to harvest, we see them pretty much back to normal. So if you want to kind of put a flavor to this story, it is there was a crisis, but now we're back to pretty much stability and pretty much back to normal. So there is kind of a good ending to this story, if you want to put it that way. If we look at carrots, that's a case in point. And one point that I want to make about the fresh fruit and vegetable industry, we can't make sweeping generalizations and say that every industry has been impacted by this in such a way. There are hundreds of different commodities in fresh fruit and vegetable, and every one of them is different. So when I focus on these 5, it's just as kind of 5 case studies as to what's going on. So if we look at carrots is one that's sort of uniquely retail, if you want to put it that way. So in 2020, we see that, the COVID impact, this is people were buying their pasta, buying their beans, and throwing carrots in their basket. So we see that they were kind of stocking up as much as they could on carrots. But you'll see that it dipped down below 2019 for a while. And that's when we get that effect of people staying out of the store because they had too much stuff in their pantry. So we see that impact happening with carrots. Potatoes is a different story, and it is really, really interesting. We see that that whole stock up effect really, really happened strongly in potatoes. But remember, this is all shipments of potatoes. So there's the food service effect wrapped up in there too. Food service meaning French fries. And there's a quote from an onion grower early on in April that said that, people don't deep fry onion rings at home, and they don't do potato chips at home either. So that whole food service effect is wrapped up in this. So when you see that bump for 2020, it's even bigger than that because that nets out that negative effect of food service. We get a clearer picture of that if we break down 2 regional markets that tend to focus on food service: Idaho, that's the ID, and Colorado, which tends to be almost all retail. So the lower 2 lines there show that retail bump to Colorado fairly starkly. Potato growers in Colorado benefited from the COVID crisis, whereas in Idaho they're suffering. And this is just a quick graphic, but it hides a lot of the real angst that did occur in Idaho. They still are suffering, even though toward the end you see that the lines are almost the same. There was a lot of wasted potatoes in the middle, and that was a lot of calls for government policies. If we look at lettuce is kind of one that's, even though there are food service salads and things like that, most lettuce is consumed at home. So you see that lettuce dropped right off. Imports and exports with respect to lettuce is an interesting story. We see that the orange line there focus on the 2020 imports dropped off right away. But then after a time, when the domestic U.S. season kicked in, which is about now, imports kind of came back to normal. And if you look at the very end in week 19, stabilized to almost normal again. So there was a dramatic impact, and it has righted this ship kind of thing. Onions, again, just a case in point, stocking up right away, and then that loss of the food service sector overtook, and the loss of foot traffic in retail stores as well. The onion market was in the tank. If we look at prices, there's, again, talking about Jason Lusk's blog, and he showed that, I'm sure all of you've seen what happened to beef prices, retail beef prices through the roof, farm prices down, ergo margins way high, retail to farm margins. There is a little of that going on in the fresh produce industry. If we look at the difference between the light blue line, the retail prices in 2020, and the farm prices, the orange prices, we see there's a divergence there that's a little bit out of normal if we count 2019 as normal. So we call that margin appreciation. There was a little bit of margin appreciation going on. And we see that in terms of this graphic too. A little bit of margin appreciation. And then it went below, as retailers realized that, that they had too many strawberries on hand. We see a little bit of margin depreciation relative to normal. So we have a lot of excess volatility in the strawberry market. Potato prices, again, this shows that potato prices were kind of secularly high in the farm throughout all of 2020. No real impact relative to 2019 at all, other than normal volatility. So even though we saw that there was fairly dramatic volume effects, potato prices are relatively normal. And the margins show that story as well. Onion prices, again, farmers were having a bad year in 2020 anyway, and just the loss of the retail markets just made that a little bit worse, I guess. Loss in shipments, but we didn't see that kind of margin appreciation that we did relative to the meat. We saw, this is interesting because we see that margins were getting high going into the start of COVID. Week 7 and week 8, people weren't really seeing this coming. So that's not plausible to say that margins were already reflecting the COVID crisis. All right, so what are the implications then? I think the biggest implications are that there was heterogeneous effect among these channels, among these different commodities. Some were impacted heavily, potatoes and onions, others not so much, the ones that were mostly retail. We're still heavily reliant on imports, even in the United States, and off-season from Mexico, from Peru, from Chile, just like Canada is. The big story here, and I'm gonna dig into this a little bit deeper in a minute. It really showed that supply chain inflexibility I talked about before. The difference between Idaho and Colorado potatoes really gave lie to that whole story. You know, if potatoes is a potato, they're fungible among different uses, then they, in a perfect market, they should flow to where their highest and best use is, right? If there was some not going to food service, it should flow immediately to retail. We saw that took at least 6 weeks to really happen. And also we saw increased margin volatility as well. All right, so let's talk about that whole supply chain resilience effect in a little bit more detail. All right, so why are supply chains not resilient? If we look at, just in terms of business practices on the ground in California for grower shippers, those fresh foods, I say that they're fungible, but they're really not. Once we start packing them and shipping them out, the packs are very specific. If you look at institutional packs for hospitals and schools, they're very different from the packs that go to retail. In the last 20 years, we've also seen a lot of contracting in fresh produce. Back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, most produce was transacted at terminal markets. Not so much anymore. It's 6-month, year-long contracts for everything from lettuce to carrots to strawberries. So there's a lot of contracting that goes on that really locks growers into a certain channel. Transportation logistics, it is dialed in. It's very efficient, but it's not very flexible. So that's the whole story, right? Is that over the years, we've developed this supply chain system in fresh produce that's incredibly efficient. These farmers are very specialized, they're very focused, they're very cost focused, but they're not very resilient. I like to, when I look at these, the resilience of these supply chains, I like to think about the difference between the US and Canadian banking systems. The US banking system is set up as a as a unit banking system. So we've got thousands and thousands of little banks. The concept there is that if one fails, it doesn't take down the whole system. The 2008 financial crisis kind of exposed that one, when all of the risks were highly correlated and brought them all down together. Not all of them, but obviously a lot of them. Whereas in Canada, we have a very efficient banking system, branch banking system that's designed to have just a few large efficient banks. So if you look at that, those large Canadian banks are very focused, but are they resilient? I'm not sure. That's yet to be proven. Yeah, so how can we improve resilience on the farm then? There's lots of calls for policy. How can governments intervene and create this sort of resilience? I'm never going to advocate for telling companies, especially in the fresh produce industry, what to do, because then you're going to be sacrificing efficiency for what seems to be a short-term solution, and you're going to probably create more distortions in a system that tends to respond pretty well. As we see, by week 19 in my graphics, the industry had kind of righted itself anyways. But is there sort of a thing that individual grower shippers can do, recognize from a managerial perspective, that would breed sort of more resilience in their farm? So I call that a market response to interoperability. Is there something that they're ignoring that would sort of create this individual incentive to generate interoperability between supply chains? So I use real option theory lots of times to explain lots of different things. Real options are basically, if anybody's taken a finance class, they're very directly akin to a financial option. Basically, the idea here of optionality is the third bullet point down. The opportunity, but not the obligation, to avoid a loss or take advantage of a profit-making situation. Anytime there's uncertainty, and in this case, the uncertainty is which channel is going to be more profitable, the food service or the retail. So if I have an opportunity to move into a different channel, and there's a fixed cost to doing so, there's that uncertainty, there's the fixed cost, there's going to be a real option value embedded in my decision to switch channels. Now, there's a lot of research that, Avnish Dixit out of Princeton made popular back in the late 80s, early 90s, called the hysteretic effect of real options. Basically, the idea there is the persistence of economic behavior after the initial impetus is gone, directly analogous to hysteresis from physics. I've used that back in the late 90s to explain fixed asset problem in agriculture, specifically with respect to the Alberta dairy industry, actually. And I've used it since to explain labor market rigidities, pricing rigidities, variety selection among grape growers, et cetera, et cetera. It is a very universal concept that's underutilized to explain situations like this, where firms get themselves locked into a situation and don't recognize that there's value to doing something a little bit different on the other side. So here's just a quick graphic as to how hysteresis really works. If we think about, sort of, we call it the net present value criteria, the Marshallian trigger to, let's say, enter an industry. That's the green line. That's that price of $6, say. Okay, let's suppose we have a fluctuating price. That's the purple line. If the purple line crosses that green line, if you use just your straight Finance 101 criteria, net present value greater than 0, you enter the industry, you would enter at time 3, that T sub M, right? But if you recognize that there's a real option in my committing to enter this industry, and I'm going to have to not only cover that cost of my plant, to cost all of my other fixed costs, I'm going to have to cover the value of that option to enter the industry. I'm going to wait a bit. I'm going to wait a bit before that price fluctuation makes it really obvious for me to enter the industry. So let's say the price fluctuates up to $8. I pull the trigger, I enter the industry, I've committed. But the thing is that I waited. That fluctuation has made it optimal for me to wait. The difference between TH and TM, that's that hysteretic effect. It's that waiting, it looks like, a week and a half, 2 weeks to enter the industry. That's hysteresis in action, sort of a very simple example. But really interesting. The flip side of hysteresis is flexibility. There's a guy in management, I'm going to brutalize his name, Trigiorgis, back in the late 90s, developed the concept of using flexibility as an example of real options. If you want to read kind of the latest application in management, Strategic Management Journal, one of the top management journals in 2017, he gives kind of a taxonomy as to how that works. Let me just summarize the intuition of how that works. The idea here is that if there's a real option embedded in a decision to take advantage of flexibility, then that real option has value. My firm is going to be worth more if I have this option to take advantage of flexibility between supply chains, relative to if I close myself off, I sign a long-term contract, I commit to food service or commit to retail. If I allow flexibility, the fact that allowance of being able to switch between supply chains has value. That's a real option value. So if I embed that in my firm, it's going to be worth more. So that real option value is really the reason why we don't have to worry so much about a policy response to that resilience, because if firms are smart, they're going to embed that real option in their decisions. They're going to realize that flexibility has value. And they're going to look at the firms that did have that interoperability. They're going to realize that they survived this pretty well. So the market is basically going to reward firms that were resilient. So what we're going to see is that this is going to be kind of the new normal for these companies. All right, so there's just some other examples from the retailing sector. I want to talk about labor, so I don't want to belabor this too much, but there's lots of examples of how firms have invested in resilience. Most of it is focused on labor. Treating their workers well, recognizing that they need to guarantee security, or as much as they can guarantee. They need to retain, they need to train, they need to support. It's going to be all about labor going forward. All right, I want to say a couple things about online shopping. One of the drivers that I talk about in my CJE article about COVID is that there's some talk in the industry that COVID has driven forward online retail shopping by 10 years in the US, and I assume the same is in Canada. This is just a quick graphic from Nielsen and their new partnership with Rakuten that shows year-over-year gains, that's 2019 to 2020 in various categories. Food is far and away number one. The biggest gain in people's retail shopping experience in terms of percentage growth is in retail food. All right, Walmart reported their earnings a couple weeks ago, e-commerce up 70%. Now, why online? Lots of reasons why. It's pretty obvious. There's Brynjolfsson, who in Semester in Management Science has kind of the archetypical classic seminal article on this, talking about how there's a number of efficiencies through online: lower search costs, lower transportation, physical costs, lower opportunity costs of time, lower psychic costs. You don't have to go in the store and shop with your kids, so it doesn't make you crazy. But On the flip side, the relatively high adjustment costs. If anybody shopped online, your personal shopper has the ability to substitute other things for what you really wanted on your list. There's lower risk in some essence. You transfer disease risk to delivery agent. That's really not cool to talk about, but it is true. Reduced risk of spreading the disease because there's less people in the store. That's at least partially cool. The quality of experience. People's online experience is generally very good. Mostly retailers have it pretty much dialed these days, high quality online shopping services. So what are the primary implications of people shopping online? Now, I've done quite a bit of research in the last 5-6 years on this. There's 5 in general. People purchase larger baskets. They shop more intensively. They're less likely to purchase on impulse. I'm editing a student of mine's dissertation on that topic right now. From the retailer's perspective, there's a demand for a lot of complementary infrastructure investments, meaning warehouses and things like that. And finally, there's this long tail effect I'm going to talk about in a minute. All right, so baskets are larger online. That's kind of a truism. Why is that? Consumers have fixed costs of shopping. They spread it over more items. It's basic economics. But the key thing there is that with larger baskets, there's more opportunities for complementarity, meaning that retailers can get more things in a larger basket that tend to be purchased together. The general wisdom in empirical industrial organization is that complementarity creates price competition. There's an AE article a couple years ago that shows that. My buddy that I published with lots of times, Steve Hamilton at Cal Poly, and I had an article in the Journal of Retailing last year that showed that's the opposite. That the opposite is true. And this is a broad-based empirical analysis. Basically, the idea there is that if baskets are larger, there's a pool of rents, a pool of profit associated with that basket. Retailers are going to compete more aggressively for those baskets. So price competition can be enhanced as retailers compete for larger baskets. And there's implications for food waste. Larger baskets can also lead to more waste. All right, what is the long tail effect? The long tail effect is a general effect due to retailing, not just food retailing, but online retailing in general. The Pareto rule means that top 20% of your products generally account for 80% of your sales. It's kind of the superstar effect, right? If you have something that's very popular, most of your profit's going to come from that product. Once we moved online, I'm talking about, back in the day, DVDs and, online books and things like that, we realized that logic was completely flipped on its head. That 80% of our profit and sales are now from that 80% that are in the long tail. Those things that appeal to people's unique taste for things that are otherwise pretty weird. Chris Anderson, 2006, has sort of the seminal book on that, also known as the Amazon effect. The thing is, for food, most of these things are due to items that are very easy to inventory. Electronic goods, things that are costless to store. Food is not costless to inventory, but the whole idea that, you look at Amazon Fresh and they're developing these massive, million square foot distribution centers and things, that long tail effect is going to kick in with respect to retail food. They're going to be able to inventory that much more things that people will be able to shop for very, very specific items. Here's just a graphic from Brynjolfsson and Smith that shows how it works. What are the other implications of online search for food? The general orthodoxy is that online shopping with reduced online search costs and things is going to reduce equilibrium prices, kind of commoditizing price markets for perishable items. But if we look at the fundamental economics behind that, though, that's not really the case. And again, this is, goes back to some empirical work that we've done that shows that if consumers have very specific attribute demands for items, and if we allow them to search in a less costly way, they're going to take more time and search more specifically for those attributes they want. Basically, it improves the probability of matching their ideal attribute set in those products. So what we show is that those lower search costs can actually lead to higher equilibrium prices. So it's kind of a not doomsday story for retailing food. So that's another implication for online search that COVID may be driving. All right, so just I understand I've got 45 minutes, another minute. Let me talk about labor just for a minute. Labor is incredibly important with respect to the fruit and vegetable industry, as I mentioned. If we look at the labor share across different fruit and vegetable commodities, lettuce, it's almost 50%. And if we expand this out to nuts that are, almonds and things like that are huge in California, it's up to 80% of the cost is just harvesting cost. Immigration law with respect to guest farm workers in the United States has a Byzantine and old history that goes back to the Bracero program. Basically, because so many people went away to fight World War II, we let in immigrant labor to take their place, to harvest fruits and vegetables that we needed. It was terminated by Johnson in the 60s after a very contentious history that was wrapped up in the whole fear of immigration, fear of communists, and I give bonus points to whoever can identify this guy in this graphic. That's Senator McCarthy. And so the whole, the fear of the Red Menace kind of led to the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1952. The most important feature of this act, though, is it created the H-2 visa program. H-2 visa program became in the IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, to be separated between H-2B, which was a capped program for non-ag workers, and H-2A, which is uncapped for temporary workers in ag. If we spin forward and look at that H-2A program, we see that it started out, and if we look at mid-2000s, not very popular at all. Growers didn't take advantage of it very much at all. If we look at 850,000, ag workers in the U.S. in general, 48,000 is kind of a drop in the bucket. The main reason there is it was just a bureaucratic nightmare. There was lots of conditions attached to it, in terms of transportation, sanitation, shelter, things like this that are, fairly standard that we'd expect, but still difficult for growers to provide. Bureaucratic nightmare as well. It's hard to file, the paperwork and things and justify the need for these workers. So it wasn't taken advantage of until, roughly 5-6 years ago, it virtually exploded. The H-2A is uncapped, so we can bring in as many as we want every year. And last year, there was almost 250,000 workers in 2019 that were brought in under H-2A. The reason why? We just plain got better at it. We could process the paperwork a lot more efficiently and bring in workers without, under those same conditions, but a lot easier. There's we're looking to modernize it. Ironically, the Farm Worker Modernization Act is sitting in the Senate. December 12, 2019 is the last date of action. It would modernize that H-2A to make it a lot more efficient. Online filing of applications creates a certified agricultural worker status, which would be a path to at least green card status, which is kind of a very touchy subject here in the United States. Importantly, though, it would make H-2A workers available for year-round work, which is a big deal for the livestock industry and some fruit and vegetable growers as well. So there's kind of light at the end of the tunnel. We're bringing in a lot more H-2A workers, but in talking with some of the firms that we're working with, again in California, they are taking advantage of H-2A, but there's lots of concerns around guaranteeing their safety, their social distancing in the fields and things like that. It's going to be a very, very hard problem for them, but they are reporting that there hasn't been any issues yet in getting them across the border. At least we haven't had any reports of disasters happening, not of the scale that we had in the slaughterhouse industry in the Midwest. Just a couple quick implications for food waste. I'm sure everybody saw, stories in the New York Times or similar about, dumped milk and smashed eggs, et cetera, et cetera. The initial impact was fairly dramatic, but luckily there was a lot of very, very fast responses with respect to that, the stories of food waste, Publix in Florida shipping directly to food banks, the Families to Food Box program that I started before, and a lot of movement strengthening food hubs and local food markets and things like that to move surplus food to, eventually to not necessarily retail markets, but at least to end users in a lot more efficient way. Canada has a similar program I found called the Surplus Food Purchase Program, very similar to the Families to Food Box program. So there has been some policy responses. Consumer response, initially, we saw that there was a lot of household waste. If we look at the difference between what they were apparently consuming and what they bought, a lot of that produce had to have been thrown away. Over the longer term, I think the big impact of COVID on food waste is going to be that people learn to economize purchases. A lot more efficient in terms of what they buy and a lot more careful in terms of planning out their pantry. All right. So just the future of the food and ag industry, I think we see that labor is absolutely key. We need to bring immigration back onto the front burner from the back burner and make that work better. And at an individual firm level, we need to manage our workers better. And I think we see a lot of that happening even before COVID blew up. Exports, I've got just a quick graphic that shows that exports pretty much back to normal in terms of a kind of a typical U.S. export product, onions. So again, there was an initial drop, but again, just that apparent lack of resilience in supply chains that we saw early on in the crisis is righting itself. And so I think that's the overall story. All right, so I think I've taken up all my time. I will stop my share, but I think if you want one takeaway from this, it's a very optimistic sort of viewpoint on fresh fruit and vegetable value chains. What looked like is going to be disaster early on is pretty much fixing itself, and I think the best thing that can come out of this is just those learning opportunities that I think growers and shippers are really taking advantage of.